Funding for this program has been provided by the Nevada Rangeland Resources Commission. Conservation is defined by Webster as a preservation of natural resources. Surprisingly, conservation is perceived quite differently by different individuals and groups. Many feel that their role as a conservationist is to aid and assist nature when necessary, while others think we should let nature heal itself, to leave it alone. This is a story of the way Nevada ranchers view their role as conservationists while helping to feed the nation.
Conservation is the wise and best use of the land in a way that builds for the future.
I always considered ranchers being the original conservationists. When I look at our particular operation, we were established with my grandfather in 1947, and here we are, 2023. Sustainability is key.
Many environmental groups feel that nature, if left alone, will heal itself.
In the context of much of society today, they look at preservation as a type of conservation. Preservation means let nature do its own thing. Nature's harsh. Nature's cruel, and if left to its own, it goes to overburdened pinyon juniper, it goes to weeds. We see the challenges in other parts of the state with the fire and cheatgrass cycle. And it's really troublesome, the idea that if we just let it alone, it'll heal itself, because that's a false concept. We're here on my place. This piece right here, 25 years ago, was in brush with a huge wash running through it, kind of right where I'm standing. A wash that a man on horseback, you couldn't see the top of his head. Conservation means we've put effort and time and a lot of money into making this farmable, and it's good productive farmland now. Basically, the only thing around here was a few songbirds and jackrabbits. Now we have hawks and all kinds of rabbits, deer, some elk. It's just a plethora of different wildlife. This wash is a lower portion of that wash that used to run through the farm before we started farming through it. This is what happens when nature takes care of itself. The challenge in developing farmland and maintaining rangelands is to minimize that erosion, to make sure that you're holding the topsoil in place, that you're able to maintain the root structure in the plants so that when water hits, it goes into the ground rather than washing off. This just kind of gives you a visual of what nature does on its own.
Nevada Gold Mines owns and operates 11 ranches, making the company, with a private land package of nearly 1 million acres, the second largest landowner after the federal government in the state. With their federal grazing allotments, the total area is close to 3 million acres. Chris Jasmine is the manager of biodiversity and rangelands for Nevada Gold Mines.
So here in northeastern Nevada, Nevada Gold Mines has kind of 5 main mining districts, predominantly gold mines. And those mining districts do have impacts, and so we use our ranch lands as a canvas to offset some of those impacts by doing wildlife mitigation work on those ranches. That can be everything from rangeland seedings, sometimes removing fences for mule deer migration, and that could be through annual grass treatments where we're trying to get perennials to come back into a system. It could be through pinyon juniper removal, riparian enhancements, kind of a wide variety of habitat work. One of the interesting things about the Great Basin is that, through some of the early grazing practices and early land use practices, we've changed the ecology a bunch and allowed annual grasses to really increase across the Great Basin. Those annual grasses have a big impact on our fire cycle, and that's what we've seen over the last 20 years, is a large increase in rangelands fires, both number and size. And a lot of the work that we do here on Nevada Gold Mines ranches, a lot of the work that other ranchers do, a lot of the work that the BLM does or the Department of Wildlife does, is really trying to change that cycle that we found ourselves in. So through doing rangeland seedings to get more perennials back in, by seeding areas into forage for mule deer in the winter, all of those things are really trying to combat that change that we've seen in the Great Basin of an increase of annual grasses and larger fires, and trying to now start restoring those areas and break up those large-scale fires that we've been seeing for the last 20+ years. One of the big drivers of those large fires we've seen in the Great Basin is through the invasion of annual grasses like cheatgrass. And here in this grazing strip, we use cattle to try to reduce the amount of cheatgrass dry matter on these sites, so that as we get into that fire season, there's less fuel, which can slow or even stop fires before they can explode to some of the large fires we've seen. Since we've put this in, we've actually had 3 different fires that have started down below, have got to the grazing strip. Fire behavior changed dramatically and slowed down, and allowed initial attack then to jump on them and put them out. And if you just think about if one of those fires would have burnt into a 200,000 acre fire, it could have kicked us off the allotment for a long period of time. It could have had large impacts to both mule deer winter range as well as some sage grouse habitat. So one important thing to remember with these grazing strips as well, they're not intended to be we turn cattle in and we make it look like, bare ground. Really, we are trying to manage and just reduce that fuel down to 2 inches of stubble height, or 200 pounds of dry matter per acre, just enough to change that fire behavior.
Agriculture is the mainstay of rural Nevada. Since Nevada was settled, different things, different industries have come and gone, but agriculture's always been, the ranching industry has been the consistent part of Nevada, especially rural Nevada, since our statehood.
For over 15 years, Dwayne managed another Nevada ranch known as Smith Creek and was awarded the BLM Range Stewardship Award.
That particular award, the BLM was focused largely on riparian health of Smith Creek proper. We did a lot of work with herding, with stockmanship, getting cattle to use the upland more, timing, that sort of thing. That permit had the flexibilities built into it. There was a lot of pinyon juniper on that ranch. We worked closely with Agriculture Research Service and University of Nevada, Reno on some pinyon juniper projects where we were able to show that this invasive pinyon and juniper were actually stopping the springs up. The high point there was through the work that we did, we were able to get a candidate conservation agreement with assurances for greater sage grouse on the books at Smith Creek Ranch, as well as a safe harbor agreement for Lahontan cutthroat trout. And and we really did see sage grouse following cattle, especially in those brood rearing habitats. In the late summer, we would graze the riparian areas and then come off of them, and as that regrowth came back in, the birds brought their chicks in. And because it was fresh green feed, there's bugs, there's dung beetles, all the stuff is there. That energy being put onto the land really made a difference. And that was one of the things that we set out at Smith Creek to show, to try to prove that by active agriculture, we actually did more for wildlife habitat than if we were completely absent the scene.
What we did is we actually implemented conservation projects on our own private land because of the red tape that BLM has to go through with their EAs and all that stuff. So we started projects on our own private property and used that as a display, as example of what you can do on the ranges, and we really woke them up.
So what we did is we actually restored a meadow. We went in, it was private land. We said, okay, we're gonna put our money on the table. We're gonna go in, we're gonna restore this meadow based on what the biologists are telling us is the best recommendation for this sage grouse. And we started doing that, and we were then able to prove to the BLM, this works. The sage grouse are coming in. They're really happy with what we've done, and they loved how it looked. It made the ecosystem a much healthier system. And so then we were able to then spread that off into the BLM. And so we actually continued. It was on a riparian corridor that had been massively degraded from pinyon juniper encroachment. And so we were able to then keep that momentum going with that habitat restoration onto public land after we showed it functions and works in private land, because we don't have to have permission to do these types of big restorations. We can just do it. And so that they put us up for the Environmental Stewardship Award. And that restoration has not stopped to this day. We now continue to maintain all of these areas, and anywhere that we see we can make slight adjustments that want to bring these birds back into our ecosystem, we do.
So when I talk about conservation, I'm talking about understanding plant physiology, understanding what it takes to keep those plants viable over a long period of time so that you can continue to have those highly desirable perennial plant species to maintain yourself. And the way we do that is with livestock diversement, time and timing of grazing, water developments, water improvements. Over time, we've done tremendous amount of spring improvements. We fence the spring off, we put water in a pipe, we pipe it to a trough so that the cattle can have good, clean water. And at the same time, we're taking the pressure off of those springs. That's really valuable to wildlife. So everything we do, I think, is conservation, because if we're not conservationists, we're not going to be sustainable, and we're not going to be able to maintain a family ranch over a long period of time.
The Department of Interior has recently proposed adding conservation on an equal footing to grazing, mining, and recreation as a new multiple use on our rangelands. The proposed rule is intended to change how they apply the fundamentals of land health to all BLM public lands. The broad language and unknowns in this proposal are very concerning to ranchers.
The conservation rule brings in a whole level of uncertainty because we don't know how it's going to be implemented. Nobody's talked about implementation, how it's going to work. There's always oddball cases, but in most cases, the folks at the field office level that work for the BLM are good people. But what this proposed rule change does, it puts more pressure on them to do. Then all of a sudden, the field office folks not only have what they have to do now, they have to start analyzing for everybody that comes along wants a conservation lease.
Conservation has different meanings for different individuals. And a lot of the individuals that would be interested in taking part of this BLM conservation plan, I think, is different than my conservation. They review it as preservation rather than conservation. And if they start bringing in a lot of these conservation partners, a lot of these groups do not view livestock grazing as a favorable conservation practice. A lot of these NGOs that may want to participate don't have any idea about livestock grazing and how the whole process works. And so they're going to be relying on who knows what kind of data and information to influence what they think is going to be the most beneficial.
The conservation rule that's been proposed, it really doesn't change anything. Everything that's named in there has already been on the books. It's already been possible for the BLM to do those things. Areas of critical environmental concern are designated in the Federal Land Policy Management Act, FLPMA, and they're meant to be used for small areas that have a direct import for some species or for some reason. The ideology in the conservation rule is to broaden and expand the use of those areas of critical environmental concern to things way beyond and to large areas. It leaves you in a tenuous position of what is allowed and what's not allowed and what's going to be acceptable. So there's tremendous concern. That's why there's however many 100,000 comments they received on the rule. There's tremendous concern of where we've taken all these tools that the BLM has not used for decades and thrown them into a new rule and said, now we're going to make emphasis on these new tools instead of just following the law and doing the things that they're supposed to be doing in the first place.
It could be putting these ecosystems in a box and trying to keep them pristine and not touching them, and that is going to stagnate some of these ecosystems. That could tie your hands and prevent you from doing pinyon juniper removal for sage-grouse habitat restoration. So I don't think the way that process is going to occur, if it goes through, is the right way to go about conservation on public lands.
They really are trying to circumvent law that has been in regulation since the 1930s, since the mid-1930s. And I really think that it is unfortunate that what it's going to do is it's just going to make us combat each other instead of work together trying to solve these problems. I mean, where's your food going to come from?
It's a very broad idea with very few sideboards and stipulations involved. The only thing that we know is stipulated is that only certain groups will be able to apply for conservation leases. There's no clarification on how a conservation lease will mesh with multiple use concepts. So if someone were to come on the hillside over here and take up a 100,000 acre conservation lease to benefit sage grouse, does that mean that wild horses and burros will be excluded? Does that mean that cattle will be excluded? Does it mean that hunting will be excluded? None of that's written in the rule. It's a very broad concept with very few details. Anytime we get in the regulatory world and we don't have good definitions and sideboards, we have trouble.
Under the Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burro Act, wild horses and burros are exempt from any management and overgrazing, which has become a major concern.
There's an elephant in the room. What are we going to do about that? How do we have a conservation lease that's over the top of an HMA that's 300% of AML?
Bevan shows us another example of how properly managed lands enhance the forage and wildlife.
To the best of my understanding, this rock dam, this structure here, has been in place about 60 years. What that does is it holds those soils in place and it keeps the water at a level that feeds the natural root system of the meadowgrass. When you keep those roots wet and keep that good soil in the meadows, they grow more forage and allows for more livestock. When elk were first planted in the area, this was one of the hot spots for the elk population. They loved these meadows.
Waters of the U.S., or WOTUS, is a highly controversial federal proposal designed to regulate all the nation's wetlands if they possibly have a contiguous connection to navigable waters. In May 2023, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against such massive control over the nation's water. However, the EPA under the Biden administration still attempted to circumvent the decision and gain more control, but finally conceded to abide by the higher court's ruling. Few ranchers, however, feel the battle over their water is finished.
That's one of the real troublesome things in the current arena of politics is, as these federal agencies bring forth new regulations, sometimes they don't have any idea what the impacts of those regulations are going to be. Under the current definition of WOTUS, this would be considered waters of the U.S. and would then be subject to all the rules and regulations that those WOTUS regulations put in place. So to come in and build a structure like this, it would probably take years and thousands of dollars of permitting. We've gone past the point of sensibility in what we're trying to accomplish with federal regulations.
There's a couple of nesting pairs of sandhill cranes that live here on the wetlands below the mine. If WOTUS were to go in effect, this would be considered a navigable water because it's attached through those sandhill cranes to someplace else. It's crazy. This whole pendulum swing is killing us, and especially on a conservation basis. From the Trump administration, who was very pro oil and gas, put out rules on WOTUS, to then you swing within a matter of 4 years. How, as a commercial operator, can I thread that needle when I don't know from one administration to another through executive order where am I going to be? I really like the work of Aldo Leopold, and Leopold always talked about the human being part of the landscape. We can't have a community if nobody lives in the community. And so we have a responsibility, I think, as land stewards and people that are here to make it better, but I think that we have to be part of it. How can we not be part of it? And so any conservation measure has to include the communities, the folks that live there, that make their living on and from the land. That's just how it's got to work in my mind.
One of the things with any conservation work versus preservation work is that we're putting resources back onto a landscape to try to change them to something that's more beneficial both from an agricultural as well as a livestock standpoint. If we just left things alone, this isn't going to change in the next decade or two. And so really pumping those resources back into these sites is what we need to do to stop that fire cycle. And really is something that we need to do on a much wider scale than we're currently doing in the rangeland ecology world. So here we're sitting at some of the higher elevation portions of the TS Ranch, and some of these habitats up in here are these areas that we're trying to protect by stopping those fires at those lower elevations. This area would have burned probably sometime in the late 90s, and it's actually come back pretty well. It's got a little higher precip, it's a little more resilient. We've had sagebrush come back in, there's lots of native grasses and forbs. And so, being able to stop those fires at the lower elevation so that these areas can continue to be valuable wildlife habitat and valuable grazing grounds is very important. The group of cattle that graze in this pasture is around 600 head of cattle. And, we'll use this to somewhere in that, 50 to 60% residual stubble left. Much different than what we're doing at those targeted grazing sites where we're trying to bring that stubble down to, 2 inches to stop fire or slow fire down. These higher elevations are very important for wildlife. There's quite a few mule deer as well as sage grouse that are still active on these areas, and protecting them from getting into that same fire cycle that we see at the lower elevation is definitely a priority of what we do. Up in these areas, we really try to time livestock grazing just to make these sites as resilient as possible, just in case they do burn again in the future.
Another story of active conservation leading to the transformation of rangelands into a thriving ecosystem of forage, wildlife, and cattle has been the Cottonwood Ranch.
I'm A.G. Smith. Our ranch here is called Cottonwood Ranch. My great-grandfather this was one of many places that he bought in the early 1920s.
As his ranch operation expanded over the years, productivity and profitability didn't keep up. A.G. started looking for ways to improve the operation. He ended up getting an education in holistic range management, a method pioneered by South African biologist Alan Savory.
So to go to these classes and all of a sudden have to change your thought pattern in that cattle and livestock, you know they're users of the land and they can be abusers of the land, but now all of a sudden you can look at it, they could be rehabilitators of the land. Alan Savory developed his way of doing things because he was a wildlife biologist in Zimbabwe, and watching those vast herds on the savannas and how millions of animals would go across, and it looked pretty bad, but then the next year it would just be flourishing. So he made that connection between land and animals and timing and all of that. And so in this whole concept of livestock rehabilitating the land, you need to have control of those animals.
So what managing holistically means at the best of our ability at the moment is holistic planned grazing, using a very thorough planning process to bring all the complexity together and come up with the best possible plan at any time to not rotate the animals, but to get the animals in the right place for the right reason at the right time with the right behavior. And that we can do. It sounds complicated, but it's pathetically simple.
It's like the buffalo on the Great Plains. Vast herds of buffalo would move across the Great Plains. They'd leave their dung and urine and everything trampled. Then they just kept moving, and the next year, that's what made the prairies. That's what made all of that. And so we're trying to mimic that out here in a way. Having a larger number of animals for a shorter duration of time on the land.
That identical planning procedure, the charts we use, would be used in a semi-desert environment in Namibia or Zimbabwe or the eastern parts of California or Nevada or anywhere else. It's not easier or more difficult anywhere. It's a very simple process that enables any person to bring forth the best possible plan now.
The BLM and the Forest Service did a joint EA. They approved it. So in '96, we started the experiment, and the first few years were pretty trying, a lot of learning curves. About 3 years into it, it started clicking, and the improvements on the creeks and the riparian areas has been just amazing. The beaver can now make their dams, and they connect them to really good vegetation, and the dams stay, and they are creating wetlands out through here. When we started this, the BLM have about a dozen sites on these different creeks where they measure riparian health. And every one of ours were in poor condition when we started. And now they're all in either excellent or good condition. This is sort of the latest venture that we're entering into. It's called virtual fencing. It's like a dog collar. It gives them a warning sound a couple of times, and then if they get to the area that you've designated as a fence, it'll give them a shock. It's a way to manage the cattle in a more controlled environment. We've got the whole herd. It's 500 head are collared with these collars now. It's an experiment that we're third year into it. Got another 3 years going. We have some of the roughest country that they've got these things on. Really, the test is going to be up there on that mountain and how well they work up in that really rough country. Down here in this more rolling country, they work really well, very effective, but we'll see how the mountain works.
We have seen with cattle grazing, if you are grazing appropriately, if you are staying out of riparian areas, you can actually increase your forage in these rangelands, and that is improvement. And with that improvement, we can actually create resistance to fire. We can create resiliency through drought years. And so how we consider protecting these ecosystems is really a scary notion, because a lot of times when we start to protect things, we just cut down on what we can actually do.
Environmentalists that say they want to, hug the tree, protect this area, don't touch it, they're missing the boat, because things are always going to be in flux. Things are always going to change. And the problem is, if you protect it for too long, then you have massive fire, then you lose that plant community, and then you have to be proactive to keep the plant communities in balance.
It's always subject to change when you work with the government. You never know what's coming next.
We've got to have some consistency. And by God, I don't really care at some point if it's bad or good or indifferent. We've got to know where we're playing from. Those of us in agriculture, and especially in the ranching community, are pretty dang good at getting by. We're a pretty scrappy bunch, but we got to know where we're playing from.
So the message here, one of the messages that I really want people to get from this is that you can have really good riparians and be grazing them at the same time. And not just little light grazing, but adequate grazing to have a viable ranch. And it can work together, they can.
When environmental groups seek to remove any kind of use off the lands, often the results aren't an improvement in the land, but degradation. Proper rangeland management can maximize the use of the land in a way that benefits everyone. Despite a constant shift in unpredictable regulations, ranchers will continue to play a significant role in preserving our rangelands while helping to prevent wildfire, improve wildlife habitat, and produce food for the nation. Funding for this program has been provided by the Nevada Rangeland Resources Commission.